welcome to this session on the Dutch catch-up programs, Unraveling the Theory of Change. And let me pull up my slides so that I can introduce our session to you. And it's a co-presentation that I'm doing with Isil, who's doing much of the work on the theory of change. But I just want to kind of give you a quick background to our research. And maybe some of you have heard Anne Fleur Kortekaas this morning talk about the Dutch catch-up programs. So I'm only going to run you through the highlights of what the current scheme looks like in the Netherlands. And an important kind of background to know about is that we have a very decentralized system with a high level of school and school board autonomy, which means that some of the examples we've seen from the UK with a very national tutoring program would not really fit to our education system. So here we have a scheme where government is providing grants to schools to allow them to organize their own catch-up programs. They did set a requirement, which is that schools needed to target students with learning loss. And in the last round of funding, they were also expected to organize that outside of the regular curriculum. It was framed as outside of regular school hours, but what that meant essentially was just outside of the regular teaching and curriculum. This is what the scheme looked like. So we're talking here about the scheme until this summer, because after the summer there will be a new national program with a different set of measures for catching up and recovery. So what we're talking about here essentially is the scheme that was in place the past year up until the current summer holiday, essentially. And schools were given 900 euros per student for a maximum of about 10 to 20% of the students in their school. And they didn't have to apply for the entire amount. And what we saw in the initial scan is that the average amount that primary schools applied for was about 25,000 euros per school. And in secondary school, that was a bit higher, up about 130,000 euro per school. This was a voluntary scheme, so not all schools actually applied for funding. Some of them just needed a bit more time to also understand which students to target, so they didn't apply for funding. But we see that approximately half of the primary schools applied for funding, and also approximately half of the schools in secondary education. We've been talking quite a lot about the pros and cons of a decentralized approach. And I mean, this is not a yes or no answer almost. It's there are pros to it, but also cons. So the pros of having a very decentralized approach is the flexibility to adapt to local school context. So by allowing schools to actually implement their own programs, they can really target the needs of their own students and do that in a collaborative effort with teachers and parents. And if they do that well, that can also build agency with teachers to take responsibility for taking measures to accelerate the learning of their students. And in that sense, it can also build capacity for the future. In the Netherlands, we've, however, also seen that the target groups that they need to be reaching are really hard to include in some of these programs, particularly because the initial condition was that this needed to be organized outside of the regular timetable. And students from deprived families are really hard to include in such programs. They sometimes don't want to stay after school hours. Parents need convincing. So it's quite difficult sometimes to actually get them on board with some of these programs. In having schools decide on programs, everyone was basically kind of scrambling to organize some of these programs. There is some reinventing the wheel going on, in that everyone is trying to come up with the best approach to repair learning loss or address socio-emotional needs. And it took a bit of time for schools to also start sharing some of these good practices. And a centralized approach to tutoring, as they have in the UK, for example, would allow kind of a rollout of what is considered effective practice across the country, and to also build that capacity nationally. That we haven't really seen that in the Netherlands yet. And there is a lot of discussion also around capacity of schools and large teacher shortages here as well, which means that particularly in secondary education, many schools have contracted out some of these programs to external providers, and there is not a really good understanding of the quality of these providers. So that's been an issue as well. And for us, it's been really hard to measure effects, or it's really hard to measure effects because these are all small scale interventions that vary across schools, which just make it really difficult to understand whether which type of program is actually having an impact and an effect. And then some schools are really overreaching in that they're organizing multiple programs to address all kinds of needs that students have, socio-emotional, but also in various cognitive subjects. And being very over enthusiastic in trying to do many things at once when there is limited capacity. So that is also kind of a downside of a very decentralized approach. Now, in our research, we've tried to support schools in making evidence-informed decisions, and to also use that to inform our own work. So what we've been doing is to analyze their theory of change, underpinning some of these programs and interventions. And Isil will talk a bit more about that, but I wanted to end my part of the presentation by, first of all, explaining what a theory of change is. And it's really trying to get a comprehensive description of how and why a program or change initiative leads to a desired set of goals. So in research, we often look at effects and effect sizes of different types of programs. And then when we don't find an effect, we don't know why, or when we do find an effect, everyone is happy. But we then still don't really know why and under what kind of conditions some of these programs are effective. What's the kind of intermediate mechanism that leads to changes? So filling in that missing middle is really what we try to do in unraveling the theory of change under some of the programs that schools are implementing. And then also feeding back that knowledge to schools to help them think through, what does an effective intervention look like? How should I be implementing these programs? And how can I observe successful change in my own school as well? So more information is on our website as well, but I'll hand over to Isil to talk about that as well, and to share some of our initial findings in this area.
Yes, thank you, Melanie. Let me just share my screen first. Okay, well, Like Melanie already introduced, I'm a Vinder. I work as a postdoctoral researcher at the Learn Institute of the VU. And I'm involved in the research project that evaluates catch-up programs well, unraveling schools TOC is one of the main aims of our study. And as Melanie said, a TOC describes the process of thinking about how and why an intervention may lead to certain desired goals. So how did we go about finding out what schools TOC are in light of the catch-up programs? Well, firstly, we held phone interviews with 35 schools from both primary and secondary education. Next, we extracted the most common responses from these interviews and used these as input for the construction of a questionnaire. And this questionnaire is currently still available for schools to fill out. So up until now, around 118 schools have responded to this questionnaire. And as the data collection is still ongoing, today the focus will be on the preliminary findings of the questionnaire. So before we continue with the preliminary findings, I would like to show you a general overview of how a TOC framework looks like in our research project. So the overview consists of 5 parts, as you can see, being a summary of the following. So firstly, in the left upper corner, you see the intervention. So what is the intervention exactly? What kind of intervention is used in schools? Next, you see the target group. So for which groups of students is this intervention used for? And then in the middle part, you see the intermediate process, which refers to the assumptions that schools have on getting from part A to part C, which are the final outcomes, which you can see in the right corner. So what is the intervention aimed at? For instance, mathematics or socio-emotional development. That's also part of the theory of change. So schools have a certain line of reasoning in how they would like to get a certain result and which factors may be advantages to get to that result. And also schools report conditions that need to be met in order for the intervention to be successful. So they have an idea, but then there are also some conditions that play a role in the success of the intervention. For the preliminary findings, we use data of 118 schools, most of which come from schools in primary education. And the questionnaire was filled out primarily by school principals and support coordinators, or intern begeleiders, as we call them in Dutch. So what did we find? Now, it's a lot of text, so I hope you can suppress the urge to read everything at once. I'll just guide you through it. I've made an overview of the most common responses for each part of the TOC. So this is the first introduction of an overview for primary education. And what we see for primary education is that the most common intervention types are extra support in school subjects, extra training, so for both for pupils and for teachers, and purchasing new methods or materials with which the teachers or others work. And the extra support in school subjects takes place both during and outside school hours, and is given by either own or external staff, like Melanie introduced earlier. So external parties are used a lot. And next, in block B, we see that the intervention is mostly directed towards pupils in grade 3 to 6. So one might say like the oldest children, but also there are also a lot of schools that report having an intervention for kindergarten to grade 6. So the final year of primary education in the Netherlands, at least. And then in block C, for the final outcomes, we see that the main goals of the programs are manifold, but focus primarily on arithmetic and language and or reading. And then the interesting part, so when we look at the assumption of schools of how the intervention in block A leads to the desired result in block C, we see several lines of reasoning of schools. And the most common three that we found were that this intervention leads to targeted and personal attention or guidance, so from the teachers to the pupils. And it also helps in following teachers' instructions better. And lastly, it was also quite frequently reported that the intervention may boost self-confidence. So the idea is that, for instance, through extra support in school subjects, the pupil will have a higher self-confidence, and higher self-confidence will lead to improved outcomes in language, for instance. But like we introduced earlier, there's also some final part. So there are some conditions that need to be met for the program to be successful. And what stands out is that most schools report multiple conditions. So many of the schools actually ticked many of the boxes in their responses concerning possible conditions that we listed. So what we see is that schools report that we need on-site education. So the school actually needs to be open to put this intervention in place. Staff needs to be available. I think this is primarily important given the context of COVID. So teachers who are not able to work, that would be a problem for the intervention. Staff expertise, so the teachers need to be able to provide the intervention or the extra programs, and the support needs to be on a structural basis, so not incidental, not just a few classes, but actually on a longer term or many years. And what was also reported frequently was that student motivation needs to be high for these intervention programs. And lastly, that the support should be offered during school hours. So this was the overview for primary education. And next we switch to secondary education. We observe some similarities with the TFC of schools in primary education, but also some unique characteristics. As with primary education, we see that the interventions mostly concern support in school subjects and training. So again, training for students, but also for teachers. But for instance, not the purchasing of new material. And concerning the target group in block B, secondary education schools mostly focus on students in all grades. And if they don't, they focus on upper grade mostly. And in block C, you can see that this intervention is set up to improve learning outcomes in core subjects. And like primary education, there's also attention for outcomes in socio-emotional functioning. And in secondary education, an additional main objective is also better results in final exams. So many schools who really focus on the final year of the students. And block D points out that like primary education, secondary education schools also think that the program leads to targeted and personal guidance, and that students' self-confidence is boosted. And additional assumptions of secondary schools is that students are better prepared for the final exams. And what is interesting as an additional point is that they are able to structure their own learning better, or at least this is the reasoning of the schools. Well, all of this is only possible if the conditions in block E are met. And here we see the exact same frequently reported conditions as in primary education. So this was a quick and preliminary overview of Dutch schools TOC as regards the catch-up and support programs. Like I said previously, we're still in the process of collecting data. So if there are any Dutch schools in the audience, feel free to fill out the questionnaire to get your personal overview of your TOC, which may also guide you in your application for the upcoming Nationaal Programma Onderwijs. And I can't. The next slide, yes. So you can check out our website for more information, or you can send me an email. This is my email address. So thank you for your attention.